Your name and the spelling of your name.
My real name is Abraham, Abraham, Blitz, Blitz, but I'm called Avi.
Your age
My age is 58.
and the date of birth.
May 5th, 1937.
The city and country that you were born in.
Bukachovce is the city. Poland at the time was a country.
And how do you spell Bukachovce?
Buchechove. That was a wrong question. I had it spelled.
Can you tell me about your family in Poland?
Okay. My grandfather and grandmother lived in Bukachovce, and when my father and mother married, they moved to the same house. It was a very large house. My grandfather was involved in business and the lumber and a soda factory.
Your grandfather's name?
Is Matitiau Blitz. And my grandmother is Chaya Claire Blitz. And I was born in the same house. And at the best that I can recollect was when I was 2 years old. That's my first recollection. I do recall being able, with my grandfather had horse stables, riding on a horse in the fields. And for some reason, one of the people that worked for my grandfather, he ran quickly to mention that I should return home. Later on, I found out that at that time, the Russian invaded that part of Poland.
Your grandparents on your mother's side, do you remember them?
Yes, their names are the first David, and my grandmother is Deborah, and their name is Faust. And they are from Rohatin, which is a city about 2 hours carriage drive on a dirt road. And basically going back to my early time, in 1939, Poland was invaded by the Russians. They were assisted by the local police, which were at that time Polacks, later on turned Ukrainian, and they looted everything on site, including confiscation of the factory and the lumber yard, and they took it over. The house where we lived was in the center of the city, and they decided to use it as their headquarters as well.
Do you remember that?
Yes, I do remember them being in and out of the house. I do recall my father at times disappearing and reappearing. The sequence, when he appeared or not, I do not recall while the Russians were in. The house was very large and we were given a little room to live. And at that time, my mother as well was catering to them with food and having the factory there as sodas. They have obviously enjoyed the beverages. And all that went through up until 1939.
I'd like to take you back to your family life before that happened. You have a sister?
That was born later on. My sister was born in 1941, March to be exact. In 1939, after the Russian invaded, for 2 years they occupied the area, and in 1941 the German came to the town and they took over. They were a little bit more explicit in their mean ways, and they simply started to gather people, whoever they can catch, not necessarily Jews, also people that had kind of governmental positions, and they were taken away. We started to hide at a time when the Germans came. They took them a while to get to our area.
Do you remember seeing the Germans?
Yes, I do. I do recall seeing them, particularly at the time we were always, when they would come, there would be an alarm, peaceful alarm, and we would hide. We would never hide at the same place twice. In a particular time that I remember, in 1941, being at that time about 4, we were hiding in a place where the hay was being put away for the horses and the cows and covered. And my father put me face to the wall, and there were cracks in that. It was a stable. And I saw through the stable the Germans, a couple of Germans arriving, and they went for my grandmother that was in a wheelchair. They didn't have time for her. I remember vaguely her falling off the wheelchair, and my father kind of put his hand on my eyes. I do recall later on seeing blood where that happened after that action was over, and I was made to understand years later that they simply didn't want to bother with her, not to waste their time, and they killed her, they beat her to death. My grandfather, they took away, I've seen that as well. At the same time, I do remember one thing of my grandfather walking away. He was very, very proud. He walked straight as if he was going to some gathering or something. That's the only thing I remember about him. He was led away. I later found out that they collected from that town about 1,000 Jews that they were taken to Bergen-Belsen and eventually gassed.
Were there a lot of Jewish people in your town?
Yes. From that town, they took 1,000. The other ones went to hidings. In 1941, after there were a couple of, they would call it actions, those survived, we were told to proceed to another town, Rohatyn, where there was a ghetto.
When they would have actions, Avi, what would you see?
What? That was the only time that I've seen it, because we hide at that time at a barn. The other times we would hide underground, and that was dug up through the floor, an entrance. It was leading to the bunker. Actually, it wasn't a bunker, it was a storage for wine or anything. They didn't have refrigeration at that time. Within that area, another part was dug up, covered with a small part as a cover of a huge barrel. And through that entrance that I remember being removed, going in and closing behind. We stayed in Bukachovce up to, as I mentioned before, 1941, and we were told at that time that the action ceased in Bukachovce, and by the Ukrainian authorities, or Polish at that time, we were asked to move to another town, which was Rohatyn. Those people that were lucky and had some wagons, small wagons or horses, would proceed as such. The other one would have to walk. I do recall after the action that we walked out from hiding that I saw a lot of mutilated bodies in the streets. There was blood, Jewish people.
Who was with you?
Not with me at the same place, but they were living, it's a small town. It was called a shtetl, and that meant that people lived next to one another, more or less. So as we were walking out of Bukachovce, you could see a lot of parts of bodies. The Ukrainians would enjoy, police would enjoy taking revenge, because they would, and most of the times would work for Jewish people that had businesses. So they enjoyed doing whatever they could that was accumulated apparently in their minds to take revenge, confiscate matters, and so forth.
Did you see any of that?
Did I see stuff being taken away? No, but the place where I lived, when we walked out of our place after the Germans left, there was hardly anything left in the houses. What the Russians didn't take, the Germans did. I don't remember how we got to Rohatyn. That's totally, I'm blank with that. I do recall it wasn't difficult, and I think we had a wagon.
Do you remember what family members were with you?
My father, my mother, and my sister at that time was about, I would imagine, 4 months old. In Rohatyn was a town that people were collected from all the neighboring area, from small shtetls that existed, and it was difficult to find a place to stay. My grandparents on my mother's side had a house, and we were given a little room to stay. It was within the frames of the ghetto that was decided at that time. The ghetto area was an area where previously the non-Jews lived, and the local people, Polish or Ukrainian, would live there. They were giving the possibility to move to nice homes and houses, so the Jews can be put in a certain area of confinement and controlled. It was an area that you had an entrance and an exit, and it was hard to leave. There wasn't barbed wire. I don't remember. Later on there was, but for a while it was just an area that we were put to live together. That period of time, anyway, we lived in a little room, 4 people. There were 3 other families within the confinement of that house that lived. There was a cave built underneath. That cave extended itself. I don't remember why, but the cave extended itself to outside underneath the gate. It was hidden. It was barbed wired at that time, eventually, and there were some branches. It appeared to be as a sewage. So it wasn't noticed very much. It wasn't very large. You had to crawl out of it. The reason that I'm mentioning it, from my recollections and from what I've heard, while we were at the ghetto in Rohatyn, there were 3 actions. The first one was in June of 1942.
What happened that day?
Well, what happened, they would come and search in homes for Jews that did not move as yet to the ghettos. And there were quite a number that simply didn't have space in the ghettos, so they decided to remain, and they were hoping they would bribe their way to the local police that would kind of let them stay there.
What do you remember seeing?
I do remember shouting at one time, and it was the Germans apparently came, and the voice said that there are no more Jews there. I was told when they heard that, they would put on the doors, "The house is free," or something to that effect, that they don't have to worry anymore about that place. Within a short amount of time, there was a second action. The action basically were that they would come and collect people. They would collect them and promising them that there is work, and the family will join later. And those people would be leaving. Those people were at the time of working, physically able. The women, often young women, were taken away as well. Later on, also very young children were taken away. I do recall a certain time specifically, and that was in the second action, that was in December of 1942, where we knew that the Germans were coming, and we ran to hide under the house in that shelter, bunker that was built. There were a couple of families there. One of them did not allow my mother to bring my sister in. There was shouting and so forth, and I'm at this point also relying on my memory and as well of what I've heard that occurred at that time. Basically, one of the people said to my mother, if you bring your daughter here, I want to hold her. If she cries, I'll choke her. So my mother said, if you're going to do that, I'll scream so loud that everybody's going to be found and you will not survive. Eventually, she decided to leave my daughter totally covered in blanket in the upstairs. She covered her well. I was told later on by my aunt that my mother gave poppy seeds on the lips of my sister, something that it was used as a tranquilizer so she won't wake up. That action took about a half an hour. We knew when the action was over there would be another breaking, piercing alarm. People would go out. I do recall hearing my mother screaming. She went upstairs prior to me emerging and my father, and she didn't see my sister. She was taken away.
While that action was going on, what were you doing?
I don't recall. I was there. I don't recall what I was doing exactly. I had a very interesting experience also with my father, where he had a way about him, how he presented to me things. He would talk to me very softly, where the other ones would shout because they were nervous, they were scared, they were very abrupt in their decisions to hide. He would come and speak to me softly and kind of calm me down. Going back to when my mother emerged from the area where we were hiding, and my mother ran out and my father and I followed. It was snowing. My parents and my grandparents on both sides had always very good relationship with the local people. One of the ladies, when she saw my mother emerge, she said to her, yes, she was screaming, where is my daughter? Where is my daughter? She said, yeah, we saw your daughter being taken by the Germans and put on a wagon. And as a matter of fact, we saw that the baby was given to a woman that was on the wagon to hold. My mother got very frantic and was screaming. And in the snow, the wagon wheels were left and she simply followed those wagon wheels. My father was shouting at her to come back, but she just continued going. And I understand 20 minutes later, the snow ended, she saw the blankets, a bundle, in the snow, and sure enough she went and she saw her daughter that was almost frozen. She survived. We stayed at Rohatyn until June. That was the last action. We were told that the last action, all the remaining people will be executed, will die. The rumor was, that's what I understood from my parents, that they were going to build a factory of tile, and they needed the local Jews to dig a huge area so where the foundation for the tiles of that factory will take place. And they were working at that time, I would imagine, about half a year. And they dug up a huge, tremendous place. I'm jumping a little bit ahead. After the war, I came back to Rohatyn. And I do recall seeing those places, and that was not a base or a factory. There were dead people there. Some of them, I was made to understand, even to survive, remained quiet. And when they wanted to leave, some of them couldn't. There were so many other bodies on top of them. That's I was made to understand by the people and my aunt at that time that survived. My aunt survived hiding. She didn't look Jewish, so she was survived with a Christian family that kept her until the end of the war. My father, hearing that he had good friends and someone told him that there's going to be the liquidation, and he decided to take us and run away. And at night we escaped. And I understand we walked 2 nights and days we were hiding. He said he felt very comfortable going back to the forests of Bukachovce. He knew the area, he knew it well, and we walked through the night, and we finally arrived exhausted. I was made to understand and collapsed. Some Jewish families found us at the edge of the forest, and they took us in, and for the next 16 months we would be living in the forest, dug up caves in it, covered with the trees. There were partisans around that would camouflage the area so we won't be seen. At night, my parents would go looking for food. They'll come to the edge of the forest. They knew a lot of Christian people that would give them whatever food they had. In time, all those Christian people that were helping out, they would be caught and killed. So as time went by, we had less and less of an opportunity to have food. The only luck was we were not thirsty. It was snowing, so we had the snow to keep us from being not being able to have anything to drink.
Do you
Now,
remember where you slept?
yes, in a little corner. I need to mention one more thing. At that time, I'm told, I and my sister, for a very long time, we wouldn't say a word because we were asked to be quiet. I remember an incident, my father going away with his colleague to look for food at night, and there was this woman that started an argument with my mother, and she apparently insulted her, telling her, "Here, Mrs. Blitz, you want somebody, you are just like me, nothing." And my mother had a sharp tongue, answered her. The woman charged at her with an axe. They had the axes to cut the trees and so forth, and she almost killed my mother. Somehow other people interfered, and they stopped her. When my father came back, and his friend was the husband of that woman, he almost beat her to death for doing so. I do recall the incident where they were screaming and they were trying to quiet us down from the fear that the dogs and the Nazis might come and find us and so forth. Basically, I remember that we were about 200 families that went into hiding in these various forests. We did not stay in one place. We had ever so often to move so we won't be found. Until the end of the war, 20 people remained alive from the 200 families. Some of them from starvation, they were found, they gave up, no clothing and what have you. I do recall, I was told that we all had lice. We were very sick. At the time of the ghetto, I do recall the people in Rohatin, I have to go back to it, a lot of people didn't have a place to stay and they slept in the streets of the ghetto, and there was a typhoid. And a lot of people just died, and apparently the joke was that they were the lucky one to die right away before they were caught and found. What I remember is instances walking from a place to a place with my father alone, and with my father and mother and my little sister that my mother kept her. My father was an invalid, and he limped. And I can imagine the distances that we walked with him limping. He got as well hurt, and that even made it worse. The distances I don't recall, except very rarely I would see the sun, and that would have been at a glimpse because we would hide during the day, and the night we would be moving. About 16 months later, I believe it was 1945, one day my father and my mother decided to walk out and give up. They were holding, my sister at that time was walking, and my father was holding my hand, my mother was holding my sister's hand, and I remember my father saying, "Don't worry, it's not going to hurt, it's going to be better," and so forth, and suddenly we were on a dirt road at the edge of the forest, and we kept on walking to a certain direction. And as we were walking, he ever so often said something similar to that effect, that it's going to be better, it's going to be okay, we will not be hungry, and we have clothes and so forth. And from far away, I do remember seeing a figure of a soldier. As we're getting closer to that soldier, he kept on my father to assuring us that it'll be okay. We got very close, and we noticed it wasn't a German soldier. It was a Russian soldier. We got very close to him, and he said to us that the war has been over for 2 weeks.
Take long in different places longer than that, right?
I know, that's right.
Tape 2, survivor's name is Avi Blitz. The date is March 5th, 1996. Earlier we were talking, and it was the end of the war. You were seeing a Russian guard. I do want to talk a little bit about hiding and when you were in the forest. While you were in the forest, what type of clothes did you wear?
The only clothes that we had remaining, and I believe from what I recall it was rags. Eventually it became rags. It could have been a part of a cloth that belonged to an adult and it was just ripped, or as there is a Jewish word which is called shmates, which is rags, basically. I don't remember having had shoes for a while, but I also don't remember suffering. So I imagine we might have had something that was wrapped around the foot to walk. I do remember walking Truman a lot. Usually it was at night. It could very well be also that my father would carry me and I would be sleeping. I do have instances, recollection, not a sequence that I remember a specific walk and so forth. I do recall sometimes at night meeting along with other people, and the young Jewish guys that were the partisans, they would come and somehow bring us information, what was happening and which way to go and so forth, who's still alive, who passed away. I do remember an instant where there was a Jewish person that came with us, and he wasn't often with us, but he came to be with us, and another person took him away. And the next thing was a shot. I do recall that shot. And nothing was made of it for a long time, for the longest time. I later found out that this person was, his family was being held. They lived in town somehow, and he was forced, so his family will not be hurt, to tell the Germans where other Jews were. On that pretended he would remain, his family would remain intact, and he was kind of kept alive. I do recall later on that made sense. He came to the forest, the people were scared that he will go back. So an individual of the group killed him. I also know that the person that killed him was his friend. That's what I was told by my father. There is a society in Queens, New York, that meets 3 times a year. And there is a period of time where my father would tell me stories about the survivors and who did what. For the longest time I didn't want to join with my sister, but later on, to please my father, we did join, and I did learn a lot of things that I didn't have any connections with, that my father would tell me stories. Now, another situation, what happened was that while the Germans were looking for us, they were also assisted by people that knew the forests. So it almost became impossible to hide. I imagine today, for 16 months, to live like that, and to me, most of it is a blank. I do know that my parents told me that for the longest time afterwards, my sister and I will not open our mouth. We wouldn't say a word. These are some of the other things that I can remember as a result of that period of time. I do remember my father constantly soothing me with telling me. I do also remember the incident that I mentioned where that my father's friend, that he was hitting the woman that was his wife. When I saw it, my father must have looked at me, and he came to me and said, "You see, they're only hungry. They don't have food. That's what they are, like that." I do remember that incident.
Do you remember what kind of food you ate?
It was potatoes, raw. It was left over from the fields that they would go at night and they'll pick up. Very rarely on occasion, when it was summer, I do remember eating wild berries that were growing in the middle of the forest somewhere. I do recall that. I do remember my father having a terrific spirit. It didn't have an effect on me maybe years later, that I recall certain incidents, that he had a good way of soothing and making it appear bearable.
Well, your father had that soothing effect. What personality did your mother have?
I much don't remember. She was a kind of a gutsy individual. I don't remember her talking a lot at the time. I do imagine her having the responsibility for both of us. I also recall an incident that I was told that one day my father decided that the Germans were getting close, that he would go out and give himself up so we will be spared. He tells me that one of the rare times that I spoke and I told him, "Don't go, stay with me." Because I saw him at night when he would go, would be usually to look for food and so forth. That was daytime. And he decided he is going away, and my mother was apparently angry. And that little that I remember, and she was maybe arguing with him, but I do recall that I said to him, "No, stay, don't go," and he didn't. That little I remember. Now, that's basically Ever so often I remember an incident being in the middle of the forest and seeing something, seeing a tree or something special, flowers when it was summer. But all in all, it's just, I get a flash so often back and then it just passes me. I do remember more when I met that Russian soldier, that something happened to me as far as it was maybe something that reacted to me, that meeting with that soldier. He gave us bread and water, and he told us where to go, which was an area that people would gather. They would get some clothing, some food. I think there were doctors there, maybe that might have been from the Russian side of the army that was there, and they helped.
You're talking now about when you gave yourselves up.
Yeah.
And
Well, yes.
were there any Germans in town?
No. They were gone. They were killed, run away. They left when the Russians took over that area. Later on, in a similar area, were also the Americans. But the Americans were more involved in concentration camps, where they went into and they caught the Germans that they could and so forth. I do remember after that period of time, before going to Bukachovce, where we once lived, we went to Rohatyn. And that is when I saw, and I was walking next to my father, and my aunt joined us. She survived, as I mentioned. And I saw open graves, and I've seen there people lying on people. They were not people anymore, they had bones, bodies on top of one another, and huge graves. One had to walk up a little bit from the earth that was accumulated, and part of the graves were never covered. The bodies were by most naked, their clothes were taken away, whatever means of watches or gold, whatever they had, obviously everything was taken away from them. I do remember a certain stench, not vaguely, and it was just a part of it. It wasn't as if I was shocked to see it. I think I was quiet until the time, maybe 2 years later.
I'd like you to tell me again how you came to leave the forest.
It was just an incident where apparently we did not eat or had food for a very long time. And apparently it was one of the times that it was unbearable to remain alive. I imagine we had very little clothes. When my father talks to me now, when he tells me things about that period of time, we kind of skip. For some reason, we don't go into the details, what made him decide to give up, unless it was the basic necessity, no food, no clothes for a long time, and it became unbearable. Maybe we became somewhat zombied, to a point that we will just be on automatic. We just move from place to place, and then eventually as we were moving in time, we met less and less people, and it came to a point that we were for a long time alone. And that might have been one of the times that after a while, already giving up, where he decided one morning with my mother and my little sister to walk out of the forest.
What did he say to you?
As I mentioned, he was chanting, "Don't worry, it's not going to hurt, it's going to be better. We're going to have clothes, we're going to have food. We're not going to suffer." I believe those were the things that he would repeat as we were walking in the open. I do remember specifically that walk, the sun was shining. and I haven't seen the sun in a long time, except instance, because during the days usually we would simply hide under a tree or somewhere in a shallow area. We won't move until the night. We would do all our moving from place to place in the dark. When we emerged and we were sent to a little area, as I mentioned, we made it as a point to go to Rohat and basically to see what was there left. And then we made our way back to Bukachovce. We stayed in that town for about 6 months. We lived in a little room. My father was involved in a little stationery store somehow. I do remember my mother giving birth to my twin sisters. I remember my sister and I were sent out to stay outside in a truck cabinet. So we won't be, because they lived in a room and she gave birth to both of them. And then within a while later, I was made to understand that the local people suggested that we should leave. Apparently they didn't want to give us back our house where we lived. It was again occupied by the local government. The officials lived there. And we began our journey to relocate to a city called Reichenbach. That was a German city. The Germans occupied it, and we lived there for a short while. I remember that period walking through many buildings that were devastated by bombs, and I even remember finding some little toys that I brought to my sister to play with. My twin sister was still very little.
What were the twins' names?
One is Claire, Chaya, and one is Debbie, Dvora.
And your other sister's name?
Is Tzipora, the one that went through it with me. Her name is Tzipora. Tzipora means bird. Her Jewish name is Feigele, which is a bird. And her American name, she goes by, it's still her same name, it's Tzipora. Cipora. I do recall that period of time because I would be able to roam around in buildings and seeing all kind of things. As damaged as the buildings were, if the sidewalks were swept and it was clean and we could just walk, and between houses, part of the house will not be demolished, and that was the places where we would live and we'd have place to sleep and so forth. I don't recall. Apparently there was a center where they provided us with clothes and food. We wanted, our intention were to immigrate to the United States. But at that time we were told it would take at least 7 years. There was a certain quota that we were a long way on the list. So my parents decided that we should go to Israel for that time and stay in Israel. And we started a journey from Poland through Czechoslovakia into France.
How did you travel?
Trains, slept at train stations until the next train became available. At that time, when we arrived to France, my mother's sister, younger sister, joined us with her husband and the brother of the husband, who assisted us in locating into a hotel. I remember a specific time in Paris, the hotels would not allow children in, and my uncle and his brother had to take the twins to hide them under a coat quietly while we were checking in with the concierge, and brought them up to the room. And my sister stayed 3 months in that hotel without getting out. I am told that that room looked like a war zone when we left. The carpet was unbelievable to change, but it was happy times. That was the first time I've ever seen an orange. Somebody brought us an orange and told us that's what grows in Israel. And I do recall we had to travel. I would go with my father to collect with mestings, which were kind of a metal dishes that was covered to get food and to bring it back. And there was a center where this food was given to people. Eventually we made our way to Marseille, stayed at the center where all those survivors stayed, and we made our way to Israel on a ship from Marseille, a Romanian ship. We went to Israel, we were lucky at the time, in 1947, we were legally going to Israel because most of the ships that would go to Israel would be turned back.
What do you remember of the ship ride?
What do I remember about the ship? I remember it very well. That period I remember well. We were in a cabin of 8. It was bunkers. And we were sharing that with some other people. I don't remember them. And we finally arrived to Israel, to Haifa. We were taken to a center in Haifa where that area used to be British army camp. And the men stayed separately and the women stayed separately for a period of time. Food was given to us. And in time, we were given a house to live in the city of Haifa. Some of the difficult times that I had in my life was after the war. At that time, I was 11 years old. I have never attended any schooling, and I found myself with kids 5.5 years old. In addition to anything else that I hardly understood the language, which was Hebrew, I've been ridiculed, laughed at, looking at kids 5.5 years old, and at that time I didn't realize what I went through. It was quite a difficult experience. And I think to this day, I never caught up. I needed basically to be at 11 to be moved eventually to a class that would be kids in my age. I had a difficult time always to catch up. Most of my life's education, I feel I got as a street smart. I never had problems actually for the longest time. When I adapted myself to the situation, I found that I can adapt myself. Basically, I can make my own corner. I stayed in Israel for about 7 years. My parents' time came to come to the States. I was at the age of the army, so I joined the services. My mother had a fit. She didn't want to leave me there for anything in the world. She kept on writing and calling and seeing whoever she could, including the wife of the President of Israel. How dare they take me after what I went through. Finally, they left. I stayed as a soldier, and I had wonderful memories. I participated in some of the activities as far as war is concerned in 1957. I had some friends of mine that were killed next to me. When I ended the services, I eventually joined my family in New York at a time, and that was in 1958.
Who sponsored your parents to America?
My fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters that lived in the United States, and they left Poland prior to the action that took place, and they helped my parents settle in the United States.
What did you do for an occupation?
Well, again, I was studying at the time at night, which was drafting architecture, basic architecture to work, and I worked in factories as a machine shop. That they were, actually that place was doing weapons. It was a plant in New Jersey that I would travel from New York. And I think one of the most beautiful times I had was the simplicity of life that I experienced in the beginning coming to America. going to school at night, during the day working, and I met a lot of people that lived here all their life. They received me very well, and I felt good. I learned English, again, basically from talking to people. I attended a number of courses I took related, thinking that I would be in my life working in the field of drafting and design. I happen to have liked that, this detailed work, and I enjoy detailed work, until I met my wife to be, Rosie. Her family, her father was in the international tourism. He had travel offices in a number of countries. And within 2 years that we were married, he asked me if I would be interested in joining that profession. He made sure I attended courses, schooling, and I worked in that field for about 26 years.
How long did you stay married?
7 years. And I have 2 boys. One was born in 1962 by the name Ari, and my other son was born in 1964. His name is Ron. One was born on February 17, and the other one 2 years later on February 18. I must have done something in the details and time-wise. So they grew up. Eventually, my wife and I separated. I continued working for her father in travel. Eventually, I left, and I, on my own, worked for various companies.
Did you remarry?
In that field. I remarried my second wife, and we traveled together, and she worked in the same field. Eventually, she joined the airline, so that enabled us to travel often.
What was her name?
Sylvia. And she still works for the same airline, which is El Al in New York. I enjoyed that period of time. It was a tremendous learning period. I got to see the world. I visited countries that I never imagined ever seeing. I was drawn often to do projects and visit countries where I will be asked not to go for safety. The more I was told, the more I would find myself going. I visited Jordan when the hostilities between Jordan and Israel were at their heights. I even remember an incident where I left words with my secretary telling her, I'll call you from Amman, and if I have any problems, and I'll tell you that my name is Avi, you know I'm in trouble. I had such a terrific time in Amman. I completely forgot what I told her. And I said to her, this is Avi. Then I realized what I've done. I called her back and I told her not to worry. I visited, one of the highlights of my time was visiting with American Jewish Congress, Jewish life, where it can be found in the world. My job was in the office to set it up, organize it, to put it together, and eventually lead the first group. I remember the most memorable time was going to Ethiopia and to visit with a group of people, the Falasha Jews, how they lived. It was really going back in history to see them live like they lived 2,000 years ago.
Have you ever visited your hometown?
No, my sister did, and she photographed every place. I visited the area. I traveled with American Jewish Congress as well to 7, including 5 Eastern European countries at a time. Was Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary, and as well in the beginning, it was kind of to pre and post the people that were going with me. We started with Austria and we ended with Holland.
Did you ever visit any of the camps?
Yes, while we were
tape 3. Survivor's name is Avi Blitz. Today's date is March 5th, 1996. Earlier we were talking about the camps that you had revisited.
Yes. I specifically remember the first, that tour program was called Jewish Roots. It was a 22-day tour that will include in every country that we visited Jewish life where it can be found, and as well survivors that have lived through that period of time. I remember arriving into Poland. During the cause, that trip taught me more about so many things that I really realized being just a trip. I was with 24 American people, Jewish American people, through American Jewish Congress. They were very well-to-do financially and educated business people. And I've seen a side of them that has alerted me to guilt that people had. But they did not express it with guilt. They simply behaved in a very shameful way at times. And I remember an incident in Czechoslovakia first, when we went to visit the model camps, and the guide was explaining to us and going through the camp. I remember one gentleman jumped at her and he cursed her literally and accusing her, "You are at fault, what has happened here. It is people like you that you didn't do anything, and because of people like you, my people suffered." I looked at her, and with her looking at me, she asked me, "Don't do anything." I was pleased that she did that, because I would eventually have said something that I might regret later on. The same day in the afternoon, we visited another town not far away. As we approached that town, from far away we saw something that was out of metal, a cross. And as we got closer and we went on a hill, and we saw a rail tracks of a train that were binding a cross, and they were on the top of the hill, and the guide took us up there, and she told us the following: that while the Germans and the Gestapo were here, paratroopers jumped and they landed in a certain area, and their assignment was to kill the heads of the Gestapo that were in control of the model camp, and eventually that has happened. They killed him. The Germans got extremely upset about what has happened, and they decided that the paratrooper jumped where we were, and there was a town of miners when we were standing, and it so happened the Germans decided with the tanks to get on that town. There were 45 miners underground. They sealed it without them being able ever to come up, and they literally destroyed that town completely. They leveled it off. As she's telling us that, she waved towards a lady, and there's this old lady coming to us, and she is introduced to us as the only survivor, that she was 9 years old, visiting her Jewish friend at the model camp at the time when this happened. It was quite a silent period of time. And then the lady showed us another part of the hill, and there were roses from all over the world. Every year, every country sends roses to commemorate that area. I saw this gentleman. It affected him. He went and he apologized to her. And she later, when I spoke with her, she says, "Don't worry. Don't protect me. It happens every single time." Another incident I remember is going to Poland and staying in Krakow and visiting Auschwitz. We went in the morning on a bus, and we traveled for about an hour. And prior to getting into the camp, we stopped at a little shack that was a movie theater, and we were showing films of what was done to the children in experiments. And then we were taken to the gates of the camp. It was as effective as anything to be there. There is a silence there that is unexplainable. There are no birds, there are no flies, nothing. Silence, death, silence. And the Polish guide took us through and explaining to us, and we seen the various sites of rooms, accumulated bones, shoes, glasses, and so forth. And she was telling us how they conducted it, where the train arrived, that the people got off, who would go to live, and who would be immediately taken to the gas chambers. It was quite an eventful experience to all the people that were with me on the group. I wanted to speak to the Polish guide, and I asked her, who are the people that are coming to visit? I specifically am interested in knowing, do any Germans come? She mentioned to me, yes, young students come from universities. And she elaborated even groups from South America come. And I did ask her, how do they carry on? They ask questions, they're very interested, they're very silent. Sometimes they elaborate that their parents told them, don't waste your money. Don't go there, it really didn't happen. It's all exaggerated and so forth. And these kids still wanted to go, and they certainly got their education as to what has happened. And when they left, they certainly felt differently about what transpired there. The Jewish people that I was with were really having a difficult time coping when we visited those various sites. Every time somebody else blew up, they started to argue among each other. It was a very difficult trip emotionally to them, I was made to understand later on. But during the visits of these countries, which are Eastern blockade countries, I tried to explain to them that we are guests in these respective countries. They would still complain that the coffee is not hot enough or the food is not good enough and so forth. And as much as I tried to tell them that you're visiting here for another purpose, it really didn't make any sense to them. They just wanted what they paid for, basically.
How do you think that the Holocaust affected you?
Those people, they were
You.
me.
Yes.
I am only realizing now that many years later, about 8 years ago when I turned 50, I found myself having time with myself. Within that period of time, I moved to Florida, and I started to have the time and the luxury to think. And I've noticed many things about myself that began to resurface. One, my lack of patience, my inability to sit in one place, literally, my tolerance. I did have a couple of incidents that really brought it out, and one of them was while I was working in Washington on a project, and I was responsible for a crew of construction people, and they are somewhat rowdy when they work. And there was an individual that passed by and looked at me, and he shushed me in a very loud voice. I don't know what happened to me. I almost killed him. I got so angry. My blood, I have never felt as angry at anything, and I let it pass. There was another incident later on that happened to me another time where someone asked me to be quiet. The second time what happened and my outburst was similar. I have never been as angry, and I realized later on, having this time now, that there certainly has a lot to do with a period of time when I was not allowed to talk and say anything. Similar things like that have certainly had an effect on me. I, without a doubt, lived, and I didn't even know the meaning of the word, in denial for the longest time. About 2 years ago, my girlfriend and I suggested that we should go to a professional to see if she can kind of mend our relationships. That wasn't going to any direction specifically. This individual, a psychiatrist, suggested that she would like to have a session alone with me. She spoke with me for a while, and I basically mentioned to her, she wanted to know where I come from. She said, I gathered. And she said to me, it will take me a lifetime, another lifetime, for her to understand what makes me tick. It is best that it should be left alone and not spoken. This is really the first time that I have the possibility of saying what I'm saying. My kids, I never had the opportunity to share anything with them as that. I don't know, it has to do maybe with my approach to them. I even asked them, did you see Schindler's List, my older son? He said, yes, I did. I asked my younger son, he said, well, I saw bits and pieces. I said, did you see the whole film? He says, it's terrible. I don't need to watch it. I said, there is a message there. And I find that I'm having difficulties carrying that message. And I understand with this interview, maybe that will be a tremendous help for me, that I can eventually show them that interview.
Did you ever discuss the Holocaust with them?
No. The family, my sisters and I, my mother passed in 1984 away, and she really had a tremendous effect afterwards to the day of her death. My father is a quiet gentleman. My father was couldn't live on his own, being an invalid. He wanted not to be a burden to his kids. So he chose to be in a nursing home, which was very unusual. It was a shocker to us. He said, I am the happiest person in the world. What it meant really to me was he didn't want to be a burden for us, and he truly made the best out of the time where he is at. Every time when I call him and I speak with him or I see him, he is always very happy, very cheerful, very soothing, as he always was at my early times that I got to have certain experiences with him. We do get together 2-3 times a year, and for the very first time in the last couple of years, my father and my uncle and aunt share experiences. I never heard the same experience twice. There is always so much that they just suddenly find themselves talking, and for the very first time I'm interested and I'm listening. I hardly ever speak of my own experiences, sharing with them. I'm just listening. It's very interesting.
What message would you like to send people about the Holocaust?
Message? What message? It really happened. And basically it can happen again. And sometimes it happens no matter how you think you can be ready or predict it. You find yourself in a situation that is overnight, and you're subjected to atrocities similar to what is today in Bosnia. I've seen enough death after the war. I've seen poverty. In my visits to countries like India, I've seen poverties and atrocities that parents do to their children that was something that I didn't believe it happens. Seen little kids begging in the streets and running with limbs, hand broken, a foot. And I would ask the guy that was with us, what happened? Why? He says, yes, these kids, they are born normal, but their parents break an arm or a leg, so they can look pitiful, so people will give them money when they beg. I have seen in Ethiopia the Jewish Falasha people, how they're being discriminated. As much as we had government people with us from Ethiopia to watch us, they did give me messages and little pieces of papers, me and a group of other people asking for help, and naturally Israel helped. And I find basically, I think it'll take me another maybe 10, 15 years to realize what the message that I can possibly give. I really don't have a specific thing to say, other than this is life. It could happen again. It has happened.
Thank you very much for your interview.
You're very welcome.
The date of this photo?
It must be 1935.
Do you know where it was taken?
It was taken in Rohatyn, and these are my grandparents and their respective children. To the left standing is my mother. She is clenching her fist. I was told she was very angry. She didn't like to pose. The little girl in the center between my grandfather and grandmother is my Aunt Rosette, that survived the Holocaust as well. The other ones are brothers of my mother.
Your names?
Their name is Jack and Munjo, are the two center. They survived. They came to America prior to it. To the right is Uncle Aryeh Leib, which my son is called after his name. He perished with his children, and they were gassed.
Your grandparents' names?
David and Deborah Faust.
The date of this photo?
It appears to me it was approximately the same time, about 1935. It is my grandfather and grandmother sitting from my father's parents. This is Matityahu Blitz and Chaya Blitz. Both grandmothers are named after the twin sisters that were born after the war. The lady in the center was working for them, and not Jewish, and she was very helpful to my father when he was searching for food. She lived on the edge of the forest, and she would help whenever she could with clothing and food as well. She just died a year ago, at the righteous age. My sister went to visit her, and she couldn't remember quite who she was. She was in her deathbed prior to passing away.
What is her name?
Chaya Varvarka, no, Hanna Varvarka.
And where was this picture taken?
In Bukachovce, in the backyard of their house.
What country?
In Bukachovce, Poland.
The date of this photo?
It must be 1937, and maybe a couple of months. That's myself, and I must have been here about 5 months old, making it at the end of 1937 with my mother at the stairs leading to the house where we lived in Bukachovce that belonged to my father's family. I think he was chasing after my mother and he tripped.
The date of this photo?
It appears to be 1939. Apparently, I am about 2 years old in this picture, playing in the background of the house in Bukachovce. And that was just pre the Russian invasion, I was told, in 1939 by the Russians invading that part of Poland.
How did you get this picture?
I am not certain. I believe my sister makes a point out of looking and talking and questioning, and there were a number of survivors from these various towns. It could be that it was found after or during. My father might have carried a little picture. I really have no recollection how we got to it. My sister would know more than myself.
Where was this photo taken?
It was taken, I believe, in Reichenbach after the war. That's my father, myself, and my sister. I am 8 years old there, and my sister is 4 years old. It's a little blur. I will just be as if.
The date of this photo?
I believe it was in 1959.
Who is this in this photo?
That's myself in the Israeli service, and I can't remember exactly the date, but I must have been in the service already at least a year and a half when this photo was taken.
Did your parents ever talk? The date of this photo?
I believe it was 1983. My mother passed away in 1984. I think it might have been just the last picture that we were together. In that picture, it's my father and mother. To my right is my sister Tzipora. To my left are my twin sister Chaya and Devorah.
Where was this picture?
That was taken in Los Angeles in one of the gathering of, I think, one of the affairs of my sister with one of her kids.
The date of this photo?
The date of this photo was in October 1993. It was at my son to the right, Ron's wedding, and he's shaking hand with his brother Ari. I have to be exact. 10:15.
Who was in this photo?
That's my granddaughter Stephanie, and the picture was taken October 15, 94. She is 2 years old in this picture.
Where was it taken?
In Florida, while they were living at the time in Miramar.
The date of this photo?
In 1911 it was built, and this photo must be 2 years old. My sister traveled in the area where we survived, and she took a picture of my grandparents from my father's side house that still stands as it was then. It survived all the period of wars and bombing, and today is still being used by the government as a headquarter. And basically this picture was my grandfather's Matityahu Blitz built in 1911 to replace a wooden house that burned down. Today this house serves as an administration building for Bukachovce. Notice as well the Ukrainian flag on it.
And the tree that's in the front yard?
Yes, the trees in the front yard were baby trees when I was born. And my father, when he looked at that picture, said, "You cannot imagine these trees because they were tiny little things, shrubs." At the time when I was born, he planted these trees. Why don't you ask him what it is?
Can you tell us about this picture?
Yes, this picture was taken in Rohatyn, and this is an outside view of the ghetto area. Below these houses is a ditch that the Jews from the ghetto were forced to dig. This is the spot where they were massacred.
Where is Rohatyn?
Rohatyn is in Ukraine now. That was Poland at the time when this atrocity took place.
When was this picture taken?
That picture was taken about a year and a half ago. It's wonderful.
Can you tell us about this picture?
Yes, this was a barn behind the house where my grandparents in Bukachovce lived. It's much more modernized today. This picture was taken about a year and a half ago, making it 1994. That was actually the place where at one of the actions we were hidden on the top. It didn't have a window at that time, there were just cracks, which I was facing one of those cracks when I saw my grandmother being beaten. And later on, we found traces of blood on that area, and then eventually my grandfather was led away, never to be seen again. And from that area of that little crack, I was able to see all that.